It is a necessary ingredient for change. Trust doesn't come easily, it's earned, and you can only move at the speed of trust. And what I mean by that is, especially when you're engaging community and specifically disinvested neighborhoods, which is where I spent the majority of my career, is working in neighborhoods where they had absolutely no reason to trust a government suit. And I was a government suit, like I worked for the government. And it's well documented the atrocities that government has perpetuated on disinvested communities of color across the country and in cities, bad urban planning. And here I am, an urban planner. And so, first, it's acknowledging and not shying away from the hard truths to really own bad policy, bad planning in the past, and to really say that we are going to do better.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs, ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Kimberly Driggins. Kimberly is a nationally recognized expert in urban redevelopment and placemaking. She's currently the executive director of the Washington Housing Conservancy, which launched in 2018 with a commitment to create thriving, inclusive, mixed-income communities throughout the DC region. Kimberly has an extensive background in urban planning and real estate development, and prior to her appointment at WHC, she served as the director of strategic planning for the city of Detroit, as well as associate director for Citywide Planning for the District of Columbia. Kimberly currently serves on the board of the National Landing Business Improvement District and was board chairperson for the Gehl Institute, which is focused on making cities for people. She has a BA degree from Hampton University and an MPP from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. And Kimberly was awarded the prestigious Loeb Fellowship from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, which I'm excited to dive into a little bit more. Kimberly, you've been called an innovative urbanist and a placemaker. Today, we're thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to dive into this topic because, it affects all of us, but few are experts in planning and design the way you are. When you and I met before, you mentioned that one of your mentors actually said that people in your field have to be chief influencers. So I wondered if we could start there. Why do you think influence is so important to the work that you and folks like you do?
Sure. Yeah, that was really great advice and mentorship. So my former boss, Harriet Tregroni, who is a rock star in the transportation world, specifically smart growth, and also having worked in HUD and was my boss at the DC Office of Planning. Really, the comment was around planning and design. Planning departments are so critical, but they're a really small agency in most cities, right? And their main job is to think about reimagining neighborhoods and spaces, and then the more technical stuff, zoning and design guidelines. So I say all this to say is when she made that comment to me and really what she thought her job was, it's that, as planning director of a major city, your job is to really help influence other agency directors and bring your colleagues along to the vision. So urban planners are really thinking about the future. And a lot of times in government, it's really just about the day-to-day. And then secondly, we don't have the budgets to implement. So, it's the Housing and Community Development, it's the Department of the Environment, it is Department of Transportation, all of those agencies, Parks and Recreation, all of those agencies have way more budgets to do the projects, the capital projects that the Office of Planning or planning directors are actually planning for. So we have to make sure that we are bringing and being inclusive in how we're planning for the city and getting buy-in at the early stages so implementation of the planning work can be smoother. So ergo or hence influencing a chief influencer in those conversations at the highest level.
So it's one thing to say how important it is to do it. I'm sure what a lot of leaders face, whether they're, influencing government or other stakeholders, is how to do it. And I wondered if you could share some things that you've learned in your career about how to influence others when you're trying to get so many different, stakeholders and groups together toward a common vision.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing. It's an ongoing, the work that we do, we're on the ground. So it's influencing, it's really building consensus as well. I think that when you influence, you're really building you're building a coalition and you're building consensus to help drive what you're trying to do. And that is certainly what urban planners have to do. They're working with community, they're working with agency directors, they're working with elected officials. And it's over the course of several months, typically, when you're working on a project and a plan. And the worst thing for us is to do a very long engagement process and then not have the plan move forward or be implemented. So all the while you're building it's advocacy, it's coalition building, it's community resident, direct resident engagement, and it's building the coalition, the willing with your peers. All of those things drive influence.
Yeah. I want to talk about your current role. So you lead the Washington Housing Conservancy. And I know it's not a traditional affordable housing organization. What makes it different?
It's another great question, Anthony. So the Washington Housing Conservancy, first of all, our DNA is different. We were really born out of the private sector, and we're filling a gap in the market. So traditionally, most affordable housing organizations focus on the most in need, which I totally get. And that's the folks that are, really they're not making as much money and they need the most assistance. The Washington Housing Conservancy, we're focusing on workforce or essential housing. And this is housing for your teachers, your first responders, your daycare workers, your hospitality workers. The backbone of any thriving economy are these workers. However, their wages have not kept up with the cost of living and strong market cities like the Washington metro area, New York, Boston. I mean, it's a crisis situation in these types of markets, Miami, certainly California, most of California. And so we're creating and preserving housing for the workforce where they're not eligible for the lower income housing. Their incomes are too high. And while it's a decent wage, the 75 to 100K, that's a good wage. That's a good job, but that doesn't go very far in a market like DC. And so we do focus on workforce. We are a mixed income model, so our projects actually have a range of incomes, but our sweet spot is workforce, and typically dollars to do that type of preservation are non-existent. So we created our own social impact fund to actually help us compete with for-profit developers to acquire these properties.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way you describe that. If your teachers and firefighters can't afford to live in your community, that kind of leads to some breakdown in community, right? So it's really important that everybody can be part of the community. And I wonder how did you pitch that to be able to raise the fund? Like what's the message for investors that might be different or the same from your message to policymakers?
Sure, yeah. Um, it's really, we have to really expand the definition of affordable housing, right? That's one of the first things. Most people have a very specific, if they think about it at all, they have a notion of what it is, and it usually isn't positive, right? It's like we've othered affordable housing for quote unquote those people or very low income. And the definition of who's in need has expanded. It's certainly a challenge, and I'm certainly not minimizing the need and the challenges at the lower end of the economic scale. But what I'm saying is that the need has increased, and if we want to actually tackle and solve the problem, we need more upstream solutions where people who actually have jobs such as teachers, firefighters, your hospitality workers, your daycare workers, if they want to live where they work, we're creating an environment where that's going to be easier to do as opposed to being pushed further and further out from where you actually work. So the value proposition is really about expanding the definition of who's in need and within that expansion of the definition, really thinking also about attracting different types of resources. I worked for government for 15 years, over 15 years, both in the District of Columbia as well as the city of Detroit. And I certainly believe that that government's main priority is to serve those most in need, which is why we have investment that's not from the government, right? It's private sector. I think in meeting this challenge, you need to attract additional resources and not rely exclusively on government. Government is not going to solve the housing affordability crisis on its own. Innovative solutions, partnerships, public-private partnerships are needed desperately to really make a dent in solving this problem. And I would say this region is pretty well resourced. We have very sophisticated governments locally, the district, Northern Virginia, Arlington, Alexandria, Maryland, Prince George's County. Montgomery County. There's exceptional leadership, local government leadership. And there's definitely a level of funding that would make other parts of the country jealous. And we're still not meeting the challenge. So that tells you that more sectors have to dial in, philanthropy and corporate sector in particular.
Yeah. What I'm hearing, this notion of, expanding the definition so that people understand kind of this approach, and then also new ways of doing it, not only relying on government, but philanthropy, private sector funding, sort of all of this coordination, strikes me as you're innovating in this field. And that's obviously something I know that's really important to you. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about, how do you get folks on board with this innovation? Because, people don't generally like change, do they? But to address these challenges, you have to bring in new approaches. And obviously that's one of the reasons that, you were called on to play this leadership role.
Yes, it's another great question, Anthony. And really, I think that we're in a crisis state in the DC metro region. So, I mean, I think that the message isn't. I think when you lay it out for people, they get it. I think also, again, sometimes people just are expecting, oh, well, the government should do that, and the government is doing all that it can, and housing is not just the only thing that government is putting money into, right? Like it's always like you don't have enough money to do all the things that you need to do. Public safety is a big issue, transportation, education, not to mention, our parks and recreation. Like, all these things are what, government just can't focus on one thing. We have the luxury of being laser focused. And, in terms of, you know, um, influencing or making the pitch, and why innovation and housing, affordable housing is needed is that By and large, the greatest generator of affordable housing is the low income housing tax credit. It's been around for 30 plus years, 30, 40 plus years. And that is single handedly the main tool for creating affordable housing. And just think about that. And what other industry is there really only, there's, two or three tools that produce a thing. Like usually fields are innovating constantly. And, we just haven't been doing that. It's the low income housing tax credit. Locally, it's the housing production trust funds. Federally, it's the low income housing tax credit and monies from HUD, housing and urban development. And that's by and large what drives the production and preservation of affordable housing, but it's not enough. And those have been the tools for the last, certainly 25 to 40 years. So, so just think about that. Like, it's just like in very few industries are there so few tools to combat a problem that's just getting worse. So, when you lay it out like that, it makes sense that you need more innovation. It makes sense that there's a role for other sectors to play. And it directly affects them. It directly impacts them. When you're talking about the corporate sector, by and large, it's their workers, right, that are being impacted. So there's an inherent proposition, especially when you're talking about hospitals and universities. And those are our largest employers in the region. And when I talk about workforce, it is certainly, when you think about the ecosystem of a hospital and a university, it's a large percentage. So when you think about it like that, the light bulbs really go off.
Yeah, with these long-term challenging situations, I mean, you mentioned it's like a crisis, not just in the region that you serve, but I mean, nationally, there are so many places where it's a crisis. I think it's easy for a lot of folks to just go, this is impossible, just kind of have a sense of hopelessness. You had the opportunity, you received the prestigious Loeb Fellowship from Harvard University. And one of the things, as I looked into that, you and I talked about it, they really challenge folks who are part of that to be unapologetically audacious and bold. And, obviously that is needed when you have to shift people from just thinking, well, it's not even worth trying because we can't do anything about it, right? Because you're trying to bring solutions in a really tough circumstance. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that experience and about that approach, because a lot of leaders are in fields where they face major challenges, and a bunch of folks might be complacent and just feel like it's impossible, and they have to bring a bold vision to get people on board, to make that change. And so I'd love to hear more about how you've done that, and I know that the Loeb Fellowship was a catalyst for that for you.
Yeah, it really was. And, I think that leaders, it sounds cliche, but leaders have to lead. And it's not about the status quo. I mean, the status quo is really not acceptable when you think about our cities and urban environments and all the challenges that we're facing. And if you believe, and I believe in, I love cities, right? I call myself, an urbanist. I feel that I am. And that really means that I love everything about cities, from the density to, public transportation, to the diversity that cities have. I celebrate everything that it makes a city a city. To that end, the issues and the challenges, thinking about that. So the Loeb Fellowship was really created when cities were on a decline. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was mass exodus to the suburbs. And, cities were really spiraling downward fast. And the Loeb Fellowship was created to really attract people to the field. And this could be anyone from, a community organizer to an artist to urban planning folks, anyone in the built environment, architects, landscape architects, but not necessarily that you have to have that degree, but you're making an impact on the built environment. So it's a pretty broad range. Journalists have done it, people who write about cities. So the fellowship is meant to give you a year. It's a sabbatical. I call it an adult gap year, where you're around people like yourself, but also very different. It's 9 to 10 fellows a year from all over the world. It skews toward the US, so about 70% are from the US, about 30% are international. And you spend this incredible year really thinking about, the issues that you work on, but also being expanded around with the people around you. So you're in residence, you're not in school, but you're in residence, and you are both a help to the students and the faculty and one another. And so think about it as an incubator of really interesting leaders, influencers who have done some very impactful work in their respective locations, but want to take themselves and their work to the next level. So it's really meant to help you to get yourself to the next level and to really help expand your thinking. That's in essence what the Loeb Fellowship does. And it certainly did that for me. And it really encourages you to step into leadership, to step into boldness, and to go for it, like, 200%. And that was a game changer for me.
What did you learn from some of the other leaders in the fellowship? I'm sure you've even stayed in touch with some of them
Yeah.
about influence.
We worked at different scales. Some worked at the government, like highest level. I was with an amazing architect and from Medellin, Colombia, and he was working with the president of the
Mm,
country around building beauty in the favelas. And like, so there was these beautiful libraries and rec centers in sort of the most impoverished places in Colombia and Medellin in particular. And what I learned from him was really that, architecture design, like visually, like I'm not an architect. And so I really got an appreciation for how designers think and the value of visual, of being able to see something, to reimagine something visually. And so that was a big, I got that from a few of the fellows. Also, there were folks working at the grassroots level and just really their commitment to their communities in such a deep way, living there, working there. So it was learning 24/7, but more importantly, it's like whatever we were working on, there were just a lot of commonalities and themes. And this is throughout my life. There's more that unites us than divides us. And that, definitely held true, with the Loeb Fellowship experience and just my life in general.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds like such an incredible experience, to be able to take that adult gap year and just, work with these other folks. And you can see how that would really influence the way that you do the work you do now. I know, to
Can I
influence
just
folks.
make a
Oh,
statement about that?
yeah.
And it's a sabbatical. Many people, I will tell you that BIPOC women, we don't often have BIPOC women leaders, we don't have the luxury of being able to rest. And like, it would, so a sabbatical or adult gap year, that's a radical notion for many of us who are just entrenched in the work. And, oftentimes people will have a sabbatical forced or unforced. They're able to do that. But most people who do that have the means, have the financial means to be able to take the time off. And one of the things I've realized is that you cannot go 24/7, 365 days out of the year. It does take a toll that you do have to pause, take a minute, rest. It makes you and recharge, and it makes you better to go back into the environment, the workplace, the things that you're trying to change. But I really learned that year. I had not taken a break. I had worked close to 20 years before that. And it really was such a radical move on my part to voluntarily step away from the workforce to be able to have that experience. And I consider that, to be, from a place of privilege that I was able to do that. But it really did um, help reset and just recharge and reignite my passion for the work.
Look, what a gift to be able to do that. But then, gift you've given by channeling that to, toward the community to make it a better place. So I think it's incredible. Um, when we talk about influence, one of the things that's just critical, and I think now more than ever, is building trust.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could talk about, what you've learned in your roles and kind of what you bring to your current leadership role around building trust.
It's absolutely essential in the work that I've done, the work I continue to do. And, it is a necessary ingredient for change. Trust doesn't come easily. It's hard. It's earned. You have to do the work, you have to put in the work, and you can only move at the speed of trust. And what I mean by that is, especially when you're engaging community, and community specifically and disinvested neighborhoods, which is where I spent the majority of my career, is working in neighborhoods where they had absolutely no reason to trust a government suit. And I was a government suit, like I worked for the government. And it's well documented the atrocities that government has perpetuated on um, disinvested communities of color, across the country and in cities, bad urban planning. And here I am, an urban planner. And so first it's acknowledging and not shying away from the hard truths, to really own bad policy, bad planning in the past, and to really say that we are going to do better. I honestly believe that we are doing better, that we have learned from those mistakes. So it's really coming in humble. It's acknowledging past wrongs that seriously damage the community, and committing to doing things, righting wrongs, doing things differently, and listening to community. That's how you start to build trust. It's also how you build stakeholders. And I think it's early and often showing up, being there, and showing up often, not just a one and done. Like I went to the community one time. You have to come over and over and over again. It helps if you live in the community. I actually wasn't living in the communities that I was working in, but I showed up to other community meetings. It's doing the time to establish those connections and making meaningful connections. And not everybody's cut out for it. Not everybody's cut out for that work. As it translates to the work that I do now, it's really about building, like, meaning what you say. I really believe in being true to my word and living my values. And so with stakeholders, with funders, with residents that we're serving, it's really being as honest as you can be, as being transparent, and really following through. That's how you build trust when you're building a nascent organization. And I really believe in small wins. I believe in the long game, but you have to have some small wins to show that you are making progress on these audacious goals. And that change doesn't happen overnight, but you have to have small wins for people to really start believing.
I love that, Kimberly, because, I think any leader can um, relate to the fact that there are things that they didn't necessarily do, but that they have to take responsibility for and own those wrongs so that they can move forward, because somebody has to do it, right? To be able to, get the community to start to see where you're going, and to build that trust that's important.
It's
And
acknowledging that, things weren't okay, right? Like, and I think sometimes people feel like, because I wasn't there, I didn't do it, not my responsibility. But we do have a collective responsibility to take, to say the truth, to speak the truth, to acknowledge someone's pain.
yeah, yeah, 100%. I think that that's such a great
That's
lesson.
not saying you personally were responsible for it,
Right.
but when you're talking about an organization, your organization very well could have been. Doesn't
Well,
necessarily mean you, Joe Schmo, it's
yeah.
you, but if your organization, in this instance, where I was working, you have to take some responsibility for that.
And like you said, you can't just be once, you have to consistently show up,
Show
so
up.
that folks realize that, you're really committed and it's not just popping in, making a statement, and then they never see you again. That's not a great way to build trust either.
No. I mean, that is what it is, you're just flying in, and coming out and not being authentic in the engagement.
Yeah. You talked about the small wins. And I think in the work that you do, I suspect it's just so important how people perceive their own communities. And I know you were involved in some work with the Arts Festival
Hmm.
with the goal of really changing the way people see and feel about Anacostia. And some folks listening may not be familiar with Anacostia because they may not, live in the DC area, but maybe you can talk about that. And in particular, I just want to think about how can sometimes a moment in time or an experience make a perception shift the way people feel about a place or a topic that can have ripple effects for the long term.
Yeah, so this is when I was in the DC Office of Planning, and we were working on this creative placemaking project, and Anacostia, this was like, 12, 13 years ago, right? So this is like, 2010, 2011, 2011, 2012, around that time. And I think there's, people like, I love the people of Anacostia. They have strong pride in their neighborhood. So to be very clear, it's the perception that people had of Anacostia and not the people living there. Like
Yeah.
they knew how special their neighborhood is. And what we were trying to do was shine a light on all the positive things. Like sometimes neighborhoods, there are issues. I'm not saying that there weren't issues there, that there aren't issues now there, but it's a balanced narrative, right? Sometimes the negative things that are happening in a place can drive the narrative 100%. And the goal of what we were doing was really trying to tell the narrative of how strong, how creative. There are all these artists. Artists often, go to the places that are the most affordable, that have space for them to create. And so there was this great artist community in Anacostia, and we wanted to uplift that and celebrate that. So we created an arts festival that took place in Anacostia, and it was created after the Nuit Blanche festival that happens in cities in Paris and across the world. We put our own spin on it and called it Luminate Anacostia, which people immediately got. And it was over the course of I think, 2 months of heavy arts and culture programming. But the kickoff and the end were sort of the most spectacular in terms of a light festival, in terms of, an not all night, but close to like 1, 2 o'clock. In warehouses that are probably filled. That was Busboys and Poets first. They did a pop-up at the festival, and that was one of the early introductions to Busboys and Poets east of the river. And while it took a while for them to open up a bricks and mortar restaurant there, they did, but the seeds were sown at
Mm.
that festival. And the idea and looking at the demand, the untapped demand for a sit down restaurant there. So things can happen. We were meant and the people, I mean, I had people say, oh, this can't happen here. This won't be a success. I had ANC, which is Advisory Neighborhood Commissioners, some were for it, some were against it. But that night, everyone was celebrating and people admitted, they were wrong, that we were glad that we held true to the vision. We partnered locally with CDC focused on arts and culture. We hired local artists. So this wasn't us coming in importing the talent. We kept the dollars in the community. We occupied vacant storefronts along MLK, and the artists, and it rent free, um, pop-ups, because activity is really important when there's a high level of vacancy, something going on is in and of itself inspiring. So I could go on and on about that project. It's really near and dear to my heart, but it really was about proof of concept, what's possible, and changing the narrative. Those were the key drivers. And you can look at Anacostia today, and it is a different place, but it still has those bones. And I'm when I go over there, I'm pleased at what I see over there.
Yeah, well, I love that story, and I didn't know the piece about Busboys and Poets, which is obviously a really, well-known establishment in the DC area, that the seeds were sown through that festival. So that's a really cool story, and it shows how, sometimes influence, it is kind of like planting a seed. It might take a while to germinate and
You
grow.
got to water it, all the
Yeah.
things.
But just hearing about the festival and all of the intentionality around that, shifting perception, changing the narrative. But I just think about how you influenced so many people, people you wouldn't even necessarily know you influenced through that experience. And so that's a pretty cool story.
Well, it was one of the highlights, I'd have to say. People still remember it. I still have my T-shirt. I wear it. People that worked on it, they're off doing like amazing things. A lot of those folks are involved in the 11th Street Bridge Park project that Scott Kratz is leading. So the work continues. It looks different, but many of those folks are actively involved in their community to this day.
It's
I
awesome.
mean, I would say that there's strong. I mean, I really admire and respect the residents there because they are really committed.
Yeah. Well, to close us out today, I just wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about influence and building trust and the different ways you've done that in the government and now in your role with the Housing Conservancy. But if you go back to, Kimberly at the beginning of your career, what's something that you know now that you wish you knew then about the power of influence and how to do that?
Wow, that's a good question. You might have stopped me, Anthony. Um, I think I think when I was younger, I didn't know if I knew enough, right? I think that, if I were to tell my younger self, if I were to go back like in high school, I mean, I think, I held leadership positions, but I wasn't necessarily using my voice. And I think I wasn't necessarily trusting my gut. So it was more about things that I was reading or playing it safe, right? So I think that I would tell my younger self about influence is like no idea is a bad idea. I think that I was and still am, very type A, I was, good student, like all the things, but to take risks, maybe color outside the lines. I do that now. But back then, I was more cautious about really going against the grain, so to speak. And now I actually really embrace that. And so I would tell my younger self about influences that there's something to be said um, for going outside the lines, for expanding and going against the grain, not just to go against the grain, but for to advance a purpose or an idea that you deeply believe. Sometimes you do have to go outside the norm, and that's okay. And there's a way to do that, and there's a way to influence and build and move forward. So I think that's the advice I would give my younger self is to take more risks at an earlier stage because um failure is not really failure, right? It's teaching you a lesson if you even look at it as a failure, right? Everything that you do in life leads to the next thing. It really does. And it helps you become a better person. And if you're in and wanting to embrace leadership, it helps you become a better leader, and it's humbling. And I think leaders need to be humble.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of folks, especially earlier, but all leaders, they might have some bold idea, like, and their gut is saying, this is, something to do. And yet their head may tell them, or other people may say, what are you doing? Or why would you do that? And, listening to that gut feeling and being willing to take those risks that, requires a bit of a leap, but you can
No
see.
risk, no reward, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
so those things, I really do believe that actually.
Yeah. And seeing what you've accomplished and the impact that you've made in multiple communities, in multiple roles, it shows the power of listening to that bold voice, and that the stakeholders will come around if you're confident in it, because you've certainly done a great job of getting various stakeholders to come together and see the vision of what you're doing. So,
Also being able to translate, right? That
mm,
bold vision that people might not be there yet. You have to
yeah.
be able to translate your vision for audiences and relate it to something that they do get. That's in this position that I'm in now. That's really what I spend most of my time doing.
Yeah, and you at the top, you did that so well, just talking about the importance of workforce housing and the specific roles and why that is part of the community. And I can see how your ability to translate that so that folks go, "Oh, okay, I get this now," is a really, it's one of your superpowers of influence.
Oh,
So,
very nice of you to say. I appreciate the kind words.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so happy that we were able to spend time together today. Thank you for sharing um, your experience of influence and about, I think a field that many people around planning and housing are not that familiar with. There were a lot of great nuggets that we can take away, no matter what field we're in, about building um, coalitions and consensus, and about establishing and building trust. And I think really importantly, trusting your gut, but then translating that so that others can come on board and see the vision that you have. Because if it's vision, it's in the future. It's something that other people haven't seen yet, and so they have to have a leap of faith to come on board with you and be part of that. Um, so Kimberly, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the conversation today. It was fun and you made it easy. So thank you, Anthony. And um, let's keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.